Are you seriously telling me to hold off on intubation right now, Nurse Brooks? Dr. Ethan Caldwell's voice cut cleanly across the intensive care unit, not raised, but precise enough that it pulled every pair of eyes in the room toward Naomi at once. A respiratory therapist paused mid-step with a ventilator circuit in hand. A clipboard stopped halfway through a signature, and even the steady rhythm of the monitors seemed louder in the sudden shift of attention as Naomi stood beside the patient's bed, one hand hovering just above the chart, the other still resting near the rail as if she had been about to move and then decided not to. She felt it before she fully looked up, the weight of the room settling on her shoulders in that quiet, unmistakable way, and for a fraction of a second she did not answer, not because she did not have one, but because she understood exactly how it would sound here, now, in front of everyone, with the patient's oxygen saturation dipping in small, uneven increments and the wife visible through the glass panel outside, her palm pressed flat against it. Watching, Naomi lifted her gaze, meeting Dr. Caldwell's eyes, steady but not confrontational, her expression composed even as a faint tension passed through her jaw. "I am saying we might need to reassess before we commit," she replied, her voice even, careful, but not loud enough to reclaim the room, and that difference mattered. A faint shift rippled through the staff behind Caldwell, subtle but real, as if the space itself leaned slightly toward him, waiting for his response, and he took half a step closer to the bed, not enough to crowd her, but enough to mark position, authority settling into place without effort. "Reassess what?" he asked, his tone unchanged, but directed now, narrowing the moment into something more specific, more public, forcing clarity where uncertainty had just been introduced. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to the monitor, tracking the waveform, the slight irregularity that had caught her attention in the first place, then back to him. "The rhythm does not look purely respiratory," she said, choosing each word with care, aware of how thin that explanation sounded without confirmation, aware of how many people were listening, how quickly doubt could turn into judgment in a room like this. Someone behind her shifted their weight, the soft squeak of a shoe against tile cutting through the quiet, and another voice, low and not meant to carry, still reached her. "Vitals say otherwise," followed by a faint exhale that might have been a sigh or just breath released too slowly. Naomi did not turn, did not acknowledge it, but she felt it settle alongside everything else, the accumulation of small signals that defined how moments like this tilted. Caldwell glanced at the monitor, then back at her, his expression composed, analytical, unchanged. "Her oxygen is dropping and her airway is compromised," he said, not correcting her directly, but placing the facts into the space between them, firm and visible for everyone to weigh. "Delaying intubation on a theory puts her at risk." And there it was, not an accusation in tone, but an implication. Structured, reasonable, difficult to argue against without more than instinct. Naomi inhaled quietly, the pause no longer than a heartbeat, just enough to steady herself, to feel the eyes still on her, to recognize that whatever she said next would not just be heard, but measured, and when she spoke again her posture remained upright, her hands still, her voice controlled. "I understand the risk," she said, holding his gaze without challenge. "I am asking for 30 seconds to confirm what we are seeing." And for a moment, nothing moved, the request hanging there, small against the urgency of the room, but impossible to ignore, while Dr. Caldwell remained exactly where he was, composed, certain, the one person not affected by the shift he had created. No one answered her request right away, and that absence of response stretched just long enough to be felt. The respiratory therapist shifted the ventilator tubing from one hand to the other, slower this time, as if waiting for confirmation that never came, while the intern nearest the foot of the bed glanced at the monitor, then at Dr. Caldwell, then briefly toward Naomi before looking back down at his tablet, his thumb hovering over the screen without scrolling. Naomi did not move immediately either, her hand lowering from the chart with controlled precision instead of urgency, fingertips brushing the edge of the bed rail, as if anchoring herself to something steady, her eyes returning to the waveform for a second longer than necessary, tracking it again, not because it had changed, but because it gave her a reason not to look at the room. The patient's wife remained behind the glass, her posture unchanged, but her gaze shifted. slightly, no longer fixed on the equipment, instead lingering on Naomi in a way that was not accusatory, not trusting either, just searching, and Naomi felt it without turning, a quiet pull at the edge of her awareness that made her shoulders settle a fraction lower. Somewhere to her left, a pen tapped once against a clipboard, then stopped abruptly, as if the person holding it had realized the sound carried too clearly in the silence. Naomi reached for the chart again, this time more deliberately, flipping a single page with care, the paper making a soft, crisp sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and she adjusted the position of the chart on the stand by less than an inch, aligning it with the edge, a small correction that served no clinical purpose but gave her hands something to do. Her breathing evened out, not visibly, but in the steadiness of her shoulders, and when she glanced at the monitor again, her focus sharpened, narrowing to the details she trusted, the slight irregular spacing between peaks, the subtle delay that had not resolved. Behind her, the intern finally scrolled, but the motion was slower than before, as if he was still listening for something else, something that might shift the direction of the room. Dr. Caldwell, however, had already turned his attention back to the patient, reviewing the data on the screen with the same measured efficiency as before, his posture unchanged, his hands steady, as if the exchange had been a routine clarification rather than a moment that had briefly pulled the entire unit off balance. Naomi noticed that, the way he did not look back, did not pause, and she adjusted to it, straightening slightly, her chin lifting just enough to reset her posture, her hands now resting lightly at her sides instead of hovering uncertainly. The respiratory therapist took a half step closer to the bed, then paused again, eyes flicking toward Caldwell for confirmation, and in that hesitation, Naomi saw how the room was still waiting, not for her, but for direction. She stepped a fraction to the side, creating space without being asked, a quiet acknowledgement of the hierarchy that did not require words, and as she did, her shoulder brushed lightly against the four-pole, causing it to sway almost imperceptibly before settling back into place. She steadied it with 2 fingers, then let go, the movement precise, controlled, and when she finally spoke again, it was not to challenge, not to explain, but to continue her role, her voice calm, measured, and appropriately low, reporting the latest oxygen reading as if nothing unusual had happened, even though the air in the room still carried the residue of it. A thin layer of attention that had not fully lifted, lingering in the slowed movements, the glances that came and went, and the quiet understanding that, for the moment, Naomi Brooks was still being watched. The room did not return to normal. It only learned how to move again around what had happened, and that difference stayed in the air like a faint pressure Naomi could not step out of. The ventilator was positioned beside the bed now, its wheels locking with a soft click that sounded deliberate, and the respiratory therapist adjusted the tubing with practiced efficiency, though his movements carried a slight pause at the end of each step, as if he was still calibrating to the rhythm of the room, rather than the patient. Naomi shifted her weight subtly from one foot to the other, not enough to draw attention, just enough to settle into a stance that felt stable, her hands coming together briefly at waist level before separating again, one resting lightly on the chart, the other hovering near the 4 line, ready but not intervening. Her eyes moved between the monitor and the patient in a steady pattern, though once, just once, she lingered half a second too long on the waveform before redirecting. A small delay that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment but felt exposed here. Across the bed, Dr. Caldwell continued reviewing the data, his posture relaxed, shoulders squared, one hand resting on the edge of the monitor as he scrolled through values with controlled, unhurried precision, occasionally issuing quiet instructions to the intern without breaking his focus, his voice even, unaffected, as if the earlier exchange had already been filed away as routine. The intern nodded quickly each time, responding a fraction faster than before, as if compensating for the earlier hesitation, while another nurse stepped in to adjust a medication pump, her movements smooth but slightly wider in arc, creating space that did not strictly need to be there. Naomi noticed these shifts without looking directly at them, registering them in the edges of her awareness. The way the room continued to organize itself around a center that was no longer entirely neutral. She reached to check the 4 flow rate, her fingers precise as they turned the dial a notch, then paused, glancing once at the label before completing the adjustment. The brief double-check slower than her usual rhythm, a fraction of a second that stretched longer than it should have. When she withdrew her hand, she kept it close to the line for a moment, as if considering another adjustment, then let it fall naturally to her side. Her posture correcting again, shoulders aligning, chin level. The patient's wife remained at the glass, her position unchanged, but her gaze shifted intermittently now, alternating between Dr. Caldwell and Naomi, lingering slightly longer on Naomi each time, not confrontational, not fully trusting, just attentive in a way that made Naomi aware of it without needing to look. Somewhere behind her, a quiet exchange of numbers passed between staff, voices low and controlled. But the cadence was still off, responses coming a beat later than expected, as if everyone was listening for something else beneath the routine. Naomi adjusted the position of the chart again, this time aligning the corner with the edge of the stand more carefully, her fingers smoothing the page as if flattening out a crease that was barely there. And when she picked up her pen, she held it for a moment before writing, the tip hovering just above the paper, then moving in short, deliberate strokes. Her breathing remained steady, but there was a slight tightening at the base of her throat that showed in the way she swallowed once before continuing. Dr. Caldwell stepped closer to the bed, checking the patient's airway with calm efficiency, issuing another instruction without looking up, and the team responded immediately, their movements snapping back into coordination under his direction. Naomi stepped half a pace back to give space, the motion smooth, practiced, but she felt the adjustment more than usual, aware of where she stood, how far she was from the bed, how visible that distance might be. She folded her hands briefly behind her back, then released them, returning one to the chart, the other resting lightly against her side, settling into a posture that signaled readiness. Without intrusion, the monitor continued its steady pattern, the numbers shifting in small increments, and Naomi watched them with focused attention, her gaze steady now, the earlier hesitation smoothed into controlled observation, even as the awareness of being watched did not fade, instead settling into something more constant, a quiet layer beneath every movement, every glance, every measured breath, shaping how she stood, how she moved, how she chose each action in a room that had not fully let go of her. The rhythm of the room tightened without announcing it, each movement finding its place around Dr. Caldwell's steady cadence. And for a few seconds, everything aligned again. Monitors beeping in measured intervals, gloves adjusting, quiet confirmations passing between staff. But Naomi's attention stayed fixed on a detail that refused to settle, a subtle lag between the waveform and the pulse reading that did not quite match. And as she watched it, her hand moved toward the medication tray almost automatically, then stopped just short of it, hovering for a fraction longer than it should have. The pause was small, barely visible, but it held weight, her fingers curling slightly as if reconsidering the reach, her eyes flicking once toward Dr. Caldwell, who was already mid-instruction to the intern, then back to the monitor, the numbers unchanged on the surface, steady enough to justify the current plan, but not consistent in the way she trusted. The room continued moving, but the edges of attention shifted again, not fully, just enough that a few glances lingered a second longer in her direction, waiting to see if she would fall back into the pattern that had been re-established. Naomi exhaled quietly through her nose, the decision settling in that breath, and instead of stepping back or waiting for confirmation, she reached forward and adjusted the lead placement on the patient's chest, her movements precise, controlled, completing the motion in one smooth sequence as if it were routine, though the timing was not, her fingers pressing briefly to secure the contact before releasing, her gaze already returning to the monitor. The change was subtle, but immediate, the waveform sharpening slightly, the irregular spacing becoming more defined, and in that same instant, Dr. Caldwell's hand stilled against the monitor, his scrolling stopping mid-motion, his head turning just enough to register what had changed without fully shifting his posture. The intern's pen paused again, suspended above the chart, and the respiratory therapist glanced over, not moving closer, not stepping away, just watching. "Leave the leads as they were," Dr. Caldwell said, his voice calm, even, but firmer now, directed without raising in volume, his gaze settling on Naomi with a focus that was more precise than before. We already have consistent readings. And though his tone remained controlled, the adjustment and attention was clear, a reassertion rather than a reaction. Naomi's hands moved away from the patient without hesitation, not retracting abruptly, not lingering, simply completing the action and returning to a neutral position at her sides, her posture straightening as she stepped half a pace back into line with the rest of the team, her expression composed, her breathing steady, though the slight tension showed in the way her fingers flexed once before stilling. She did not respond, did not explain, but her eyes remained on the monitor, tracking the newly defined pattern, the confirmation she had needed now visible, even if unacknowledged. The room held that moment longer than it should have. The silence not empty but observant, a collective awareness settling over the small shift that had just occurred, and then movement resumed again, quieter, more deliberate, as if each person was recalibrating to a slightly altered balance. Naomi adjusted the edge of her glove at the wrist, a small, controlled motion, then rested her hand lightly against the chart stand, grounding herself back into the routine, her stance aligned, her presence measured, while Dr. Caldwell resumed his review, his posture unchanged, his control intact, the room following his lead once more, even as the trace on the monitor now carried a clarity that had not been there before. The sharpened waveform held for 2 beats longer than before, clear enough now that it could not be dismissed as artifact, and Naomi's gaze stayed locked on it, as the numbers updated in small, steady increments, her fingers resting lightly against the chart stand without moving, as if any unnecessary motion might disrupt the clarity she had just uncovered. Across from her, Dr. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly at the screen, not in doubt, but in calculation, and he shifted his stance just enough to square himself fully to the monitor, one hand lifting to point at the oxygen saturation reading. "We are not delaying airway management," he said, his tone still controlled but more directive now, the sentence placed into the room with intention. "Prepare for intubation," and the words moved through the team immediately, the respiratory therapist stepping forward, the intern setting the tablet aside, another nurse reaching for supplies with practiced efficiency. Naomi did not move at first, her attention flicking once more between the waveform and the pulse reading, the mismatch now more pronounced after her adjustment, the pattern aligning with what she had suspected, but still without formal confirmation, and she felt the weight of that gap press in as the room accelerated around the order. A tray was positioned beside the bed, instruments arranged in a sequence that implied inevitability, and the patient's wife shifted outside the glass, her posture tightening as she watched the sudden increase in activity, her eyes no longer searching but fixed, waiting for something she could not name. Naomi's hand lifted from the chart, hovering for a moment as if deciding whether to reach for the medication drawer or step back entirely, and that hesitation stretched just long enough to be noticed by the nurse beside her, who glanced at her briefly before continuing her task. "Nurse Brooks," Dr. Caldwell said without raising his voice. But this time he did not look at the monitor when he spoke, his gaze settling directly on Naomi, holding there, confirm readiness, and the request landed with a clarity that narrowed her options into something immediate and visible, not a suggestion, not a shared decision, but a point of response that the entire room could track. Naomi straightened slightly, her shoulders aligning, her chin lifting just enough to meet the moment, and for a fraction of a second she did not answer, her eyes dropping once more to the waveform, then to the patient's chest, then back to Caldwell. The sequence quick, controlled, but deliberate. The respiratory therapist paused mid-adjustment, one hand on the ventilator, waiting, while the intern's pen hovered again above the chart, unmoving, and the subtle sounds of the room, fabric shifting, a monitor beeping, seemed to recede into the background as attention gathered, focused and quiet. Naomi's fingers brushed the edge of the medication drawer, pulling it open halfway, then stopping, her grip tightening slightly on the handle before easing. The drawer left suspended between closed and open, and she inhaled once, steady and measured, before speaking, her voice calm but lower than before. "I recommend we reassess the rhythm before proceeding." And the words, though not loud, carried enough to be heard, enough to register. Dr. Caldwell did not respond immediately, and in that brief silence he held the room, his gaze fixed on her, not questioning, not searching, simply asserting presence, and then he stepped closer by a small but definitive measure, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance further. "That is not your call," he said, the sentence short, controlled, and placed without emphasis, but firm enough that it redirected the entire moment back under his authority. Naomi's hand released the drawer, letting it slide shut with a soft click, her posture adjusting again as she stepped a fraction to the side, creating space without retreating fully, her eyes returning to the monitor even as the team resumed motion around her. The pressure of the moment now fully formed, visible in the quickened pace of preparation, the tightened focus of those nearby, and the continued stillness of the gaze on her from across the glass. The ventilator was brought closer, the tubing aligned, and Naomi's hand hovered once more near the tray, not moving forward, not pulling back, caught in the narrow space between action and restraint, while Dr. Caldwell turned his attention back to the patient, issuing the next instruction with the same steady cadence, the room responding in unison, leaving Naomi to stand within the tension she had not resolved, the decision no longer abstract but immediate, her next movement certain to be seen, measured, and remembered. The room did not accelerate again. It settled into something slower, heavier, as if the urgency had paused just short of action, leaving everything suspended in place. And Naomi remained where she stood beside the tray, her hand no longer hovering but resting lightly against the edge, fingers relaxed but not fully still, the slight flex of her knuckles betraying a tension she kept contained. The ventilator stood ready, tubing aligned, yet no one moved to complete the next step, the sequence. Interrupted not by command but by the absence of one, and that absence stretched, noticeable in the way the intern's pen lowered to the paper but did not write, the tip resting there without marking anything. Naomi's gaze stayed on the monitor, tracking the waveform with a steadier rhythm now, though once her eyes drifted, just briefly, toward the patient's chest before returning, as if confirming something she already understood, her shoulders rising a fraction with a quiet inhale, then settling again. Dr. Caldwell stood near the foot of the bed, his posture unchanged, but his attention lingered longer now, not moving immediately to the next instruction, his eyes shifting between the screen and Naomi with a measured stillness that did not concede anything, only observed, his hand resting against the side rail, without tapping or gesturing. The patient's wife remained at the glass, her palms still pressed flat, but her fingers had curled slightly inward, the tension in that small movement echoing the room's quiet pause. Her gaze fixed not on the equipment, but on Naomi, waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. Naomi adjusted her stance by less than an inch, redistributing her weight, then reached to straighten a section of tubing that had not actually shifted, smoothing it along the tray with careful precision, the motion slow, deliberate, giving her hands a task that required focus but not urgency. When she withdrew her hand, she paused again, just for a beat, her fingers brushing together lightly before separating, and she glanced once more at the waveform, her eyes narrowing slightly in concentration, then softening as she exhaled through her nose. The quiet in the room held, not empty, but attentive, as if everyone was listening for something beneath the surface, the monitors continuing their steady rhythm, the soft hum of equipment filling the spaces between breaths. Dr. Caldwell did not speak, but his gaze remained, a fraction longer each time it returned to Naomi, not questioning, not yielding, simply present, and in that stillness the control he held did not loosen, it only stretched. Naomi reached for the chart again, flipping a single page with controlled care, her movements slower than before but more certain, and when she wrote, the strokes were deliberate, evenly spaced, her hand steady despite the weight of the moment. She lifted her eyes once more to the monitor, holding the waveform in her focus, and for a second, everything else seemed to recede. The room, the eyes, the expectation, leaving only the pattern she had been trying to show. If this moment feels like it is holding its breath, it is because it is not over yet, and Naomi remained exactly where she needed to be, composed, attentive, waiting without stepping back, as the room stayed suspended around a decision that had not yet been made. The waveform held steady for another beat, then shifted, subtly at first, a tightening in the spacing that Naomi had been tracking all along. And this time the change did not fade back into noise. It sharpened, repeated, and then a soft alert tone sounded from the monitor, not loud, but distinct enough to cut through the suspended quiet, and the intern's head lifted immediately, eyes locking onto the screen as his pen slipped from the page without writing. Naomi did not move, her gaze already fixed on the pattern as it resolved into something unmistakable, the irregular rhythm now clearly defined, each beat slightly delayed in a way that no longer matched the oxygen reading. And within seconds a second system confirmed it, the telemetry panel above the bed flashing a warning line that had not been there before, its text brief but precise, flagging a cardiac irregularity that aligned exactly with what Naomi had been watching, the respiratory therapist's hand still resting on the ventilator tubing, paused mid-adjustment, fingers tightening slightly around the plastic as he looked from the screen to Dr. Caldwell. Waiting, Dr. Caldwell's hand, which had just begun to reach toward the patient's airway, stopped in place, suspended inches above, his posture holding for a fraction longer than before, and for the first time his gaze did not move forward with the sequence. It dropped directly to the waveform Naomi had corrected. The room shifted around that moment, not with noise, but with attention, every glance pulling toward the monitor, toward the confirmation that had just surfaced, the silence no longer uncertain but focused. The intern leaned in closer to the screen, scrolling quickly now, his movements no longer measured but reactive. "There is a conduction delay," he said under his breath, not announcing it, just stating what he saw. And another nurse stepped slightly to the side to get a clearer view, her posture changing from task-oriented to observational. Naomi's hands remained at her sides, still, her posture unchanged, her focus steady on the monitor as the pattern repeated again, identical, undeniable. The earlier mismatch now resolved into a clear signal that no longer depended on interpretation. Dr. Caldwell's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly as he lowered his hand from the airway, not abruptly, but with a controlled pause that broke the forward motion he had maintained until now, and his eyes flicked once toward Naomi before returning to the screen. The movement brief, but visible to anyone watching closely. The patient's wife outside the glass leaned closer, her palm pressing harder against the surface, her gaze following the direction of the room, no longer fixed on Naomi alone but on the monitor that now held everyone's attention. The ventilator remained in place, untouched, its readiness now out of sync with the moment, and the respiratory therapist eased his grip slightly, waiting for a new instruction that did not come immediately. Dr. Caldwell inhaled once, steady, then spoke, his voice still controlled but no longer carrying the same uninterrupted cadence. "Hold," he said, a single word that redirected the room, and in that shift the sequence stopped, the inevitability broken. The intern nodded quickly, stepping back half a pace, while the nurse at the pump adjusted her stance, her attention fully on the screen now. Naomi did not step forward, did not claim the moment, but her eyes remained on the waveform as it continued to confirm what she had seen from the beginning, the pattern repeating with consistency that left no space for dismissal. The room held that new alignment, the focus no longer on her hesitation, but on the data she had revealed, and Dr. Caldwell stood still for a second longer than usual, his hand resting against the rail again, not moving to the next step, the control he had maintained now interrupted by something he could not override, only acknowledge through the pause that settled across the entire unit. The pause did not break all at once. It shifted, redistributed, and Dr. Caldwell was the first to move within it, though not in the same way as before, his hand resting on the rail for a fraction longer before lifting, his fingers adjusting their position as if recalibrating rather than directing. And when he spoke again, his voice remained controlled, but the timing carried a slight delay that had not been there earlier. "Let us verify the lead integrity," he said, the phrasing measured, neutral, but different from the immediate directives that had driven the room minutes before. His gaze moved to the monitor, then to Naomi, not as a challenge, but as a point of reference, holding for a second longer than necessary before shifting back to the screen. Naomi did not respond to the look, her attention already on the waveform, her posture steady, her hands moving with quiet precision as she reached to check the connections she had adjusted, confirming placement without hurry, her fingers pressing lightly against each contact point before releasing. The intern stepped closer to the monitor, scrolling through the data with renewed focus, his earlier hesitation replaced by a sharper attention, and he glanced briefly toward Naomi, as if aligning what he saw with what she had already recognized, then back to the screen. The respiratory therapist eased the ventilator a few inches away from the bed, not removing it, just creating space, his movements slower, more deliberate, waiting for direction that was no longer automatic. Dr. Caldwell shifted his stance again, a subtle step to the side that opened the line of sight between Naomi and the monitor, his shoulder no longer blocking the view. And though the movement was small, it changed the arrangement of the space, placing Naomi's position more centrally within the shared focus. He reached toward the monitor, his hand hovering just short of the controls before making a minor adjustment to the display settings, expanding the waveform for clarity, an action that acknowledged the detail without naming it. Naomi continued her check, her movements consistent, her breathing steady, and when she finished, she returned her hands to a neutral position at her sides, her gaze still on the monitor, tracking the now enlarged pattern with the same calm focus. The nurse at the medication pump adjusted her stance, turning slightly toward Naomi rather than Dr. Caldwell, her attention following the line of the waveform. While the intern spoke again, quieter this time, but more certain, the delay is consistent, and the words settled into the room without challenge. Dr. Caldwell did not interrupt, his posture holding, his eyes moving once more between the screen and Naomi. And when he spoke, his tone remained even, but the directive had shifted. "We will hold intubation," he said, the decision placed into the space with controlled clarity, no longer immediate, no longer unquestioned, and the room responded accordingly, the sequence of preparation easing, hands lowering, movements slowing, the tension not gone but redistributed into a more focused attention. Naomi did not react outwardly to the change, her posture unchanged, her focus steady. As she reached for the chart and recorded the updated observation, her pen moving in deliberate strokes. The sound of it soft but clear in the quieter room. The patient's wife outside the glass shifted her weight, her hand lowering slightly from the surface, her gaze now moving between Naomi and Dr. Caldwell, following the exchange that no longer needed to be spoken. Dr. Caldwell remained near the bed, his hand resting lightly against the rail again, but his stillness now carried a different weight, less about control, more about holding position within a space that had adjusted around him, and, though he did not relinquish authority, the way he occupied it had changed, his attention no longer singular, his actions no longer immediate, as the room settled into a new rhythm shaped by what had just been confirmed. The room settled into a quieter rhythm, the earlier urgency replaced by measured movement, and Dr. Caldwell remained by the bed for a moment longer before shifting his weight and stepping slightly to the side, creating a clear line of space between himself and the monitor where Naomi stood. His hand lifted as if to reach for the controls again, then paused midair, and instead of completing the motion, he lowered it and turned his head toward Naomi, holding the look just long enough to be unmistakable. "Go ahead," he said, the words brief, even, but directed, not as a correction, not as a test, but as an opening, and the room registered it immediately in the way attention moved. Not sharply, not dramatically, but with a subtle realignment that placed Naomi at the center of the next action. Naomi did not react to the shift in tone, her posture unchanged as she stepped forward the same half pace she had held back before, her hands moving with calm precision as she adjusted the monitor settings and confirmed the rhythm again, her focus steady, her movements efficient and unhurried. Dr. Caldwell did not interrupt, did not step in, his stance remaining where it was, slightly back from the bed now, his attention following her actions rather than leading them. The intern resumed writing, this time without hesitation, while the respiratory therapist eased the ventilator another few inches away. No longer poised for immediate use, the nurse at the pump returned to her. Adjustments, her movements smoother, the earlier pauses gone. Outside the glass, the patient's wife lowered her hand completely, her shoulders easing as she watched the room settle, her gaze no longer fixed, but moving naturally between the staff. Naomi finished the adjustment and stepped back into her original position, her hands returning to rest lightly at her sides, her eyes still on the monitor. Maintaining the same steady presence she had held from the beginning, Dr. Caldwell remained quiet, his posture relaxed but no longer centered in the same way. The space around the bed no longer arranged solely around him. A few seconds passed, and then the room moved on. Conversations resuming in low, professional tones, footsteps returning to their usual pace, the earlier weight dispersing into routine. The monitor continued its steady pattern, clear and consistent. And Naomi made a small notation on the chart before setting the pen down, aligning it neatly with the edge. No one looked at her the way they had before, the attention no longer lingering, the moment absorbed into the flow of the unit. If you felt that shift, you already understand why moments like this stay with people long after they pass. So consider sharing your thoughts and following along for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.